ladies who don't know who Tom is Santa.
Uh,
The nicest guy in the world.
I'm just going to say a few things by way of introduction again to the live stream community to say welcome. We have our little community of the Zoom group is here online, and those of you who are just joining with the HMPC live stream, welcome to you. I do invite your comments. I have my phone beside me here, so if you're on YouTube and you scroll down to the bottom, you can comment, and we'll be happy to incorporate your comments in our discussion. We move pretty fast, though, I think. So just simply make your comments at the bottom, and I'll try to see them and respond. Otherwise, welcome to everybody else. Glad to have you here. We may have a few still that will join us. I hope that mostly now the difficulty in getting into the Zoom have been removed. Colette seems to be able to get in without a wrinkle anymore.
Yeah.
And
Hallelujah.
I was a little worried at first. Later on, just an hour ago, I thought, oh, I didn't put in the Zoom invitation that the time was changing to 7 o'clock. But when I looked at the Zoom invitation, it didn't give any time. It didn't say what time we were meeting. So I followed up with an email to say we were starting at 7, and here we are.
Yeah.
So, everybody okay?
Okay.
Glad
It's
you're
been a
here.
very good week. Got a lot of things done, but my leaves are still up in the trees. I'm waiting for a friend to break up my leaves, but I can't do anything. They're still looking up at me.
Aw, really?
You mean you can't
My,
hide? You
my
can't-
ground looks yellow.
Yeah, me too.
You have to hire one of those landscapers that'll climb up in your tree and rake your
You
leaves.
shake it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, those, what was it, kind of a nut farmer that has a machine that grabs the trunk,
Shakes it.
shakes it so all the walnuts fall to the ground.
My apple trees are empty. I have a few maple trees still thinking about it. My birch trees are just turning yellow. And I have a tulip tree that has the biggest leaves. And they're the last ones to fall and the hardest ones to break.
Mhm. Of course.
Well, listen, I just keep reminding myself, soon it'll snow.
Yeah.
And then I say, and soon it will be spring again. So I'm going to try to live every day one at a time. But there's a few
Yes.
days, there's a few days coming up I'd like to skip. But, Barbara, when do you fly? When do you fly south?
January 5th.
Oh, good. We have you longer this year. That's good.
No, about the same.
Is it really?
Yep.
Good.
Yeah, just because we weren't in church last year. You
Oh,
wouldn't
right.
have
So I didn't know when you left.
known. Right.
Didn't miss you, huh?
Can't miss
Yeah,
you when
but-
I don't see you. All right. So why don't we begin and read? We are in Ezra, and I don't know for sure. I was reading ahead a little bit, and I don't remember where we left off. Did we finish 6?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I
Right?
have down that we should start with 8.
Okay, good.
That's what I have.
All right, that's good. And I don't know who's going to read, but I just want to say some of this we can skip over because there's a lot of the genealogy again. They're trying to lay down a history that establishes authenticity of the community as real descendants of those who were part of the original Israel or original Judah. And so some of that is in this chapter 8. So who would like to read?
I can't pronounce half of those names.
Yeah. Anybody? Don't be bashful. Debbie, I choose you.
Oh, my God.
Yes.
All
I
right.
love you, Debbie.
Sure you do. How about we skip the first
Yeah.
14 verses? Because
I'm up-
all it
yeah,
is,
yep.
like you said, is
I
the
agree.
genealogy.
Yep. Let's do that. We'll go to 15. I gathered them by the river, and that's
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, doke. I gathered them by the river that runs to Ahava, and there we camped 3 days. As I reviewed the people and the priests, I found there none of the descendants of Levi. Then I sent for Eleazar, Ariel, Shemaiah, Elnathan, Jarib, Elnathan, Nathan, Zechariah, and Meshullam, who were leaders, and for Joiarib and Elnathan, who were wise. They could have mixed up those names a bit.
I know.
Anyway, and sent them to Edo, the leader at the place called Casaphia, telling them what to say to Edo and his colleagues, the temple servants at Casaphia, namely, to send us ministers for the house of God. Since the gracious hand of our God was upon us, they brought us a man of discretion of the descendants of Mahli, son of Levi, son of Israel, namely Sherebiah, with his sons and kin 18. Also Hashabiah, and with him Jeshiah of the descendants of Merari, and his kin, and their sons 20, besides 220 of the temple servants, whom David and his officials had set apart to attend the Levites. These were all mentioned by name. Not here, though, thank God.
Yeah.
Then I proclaimed a fast there at the river Ahava, that we might humble ourselves before our God, to seek from him a safe journey for ourselves, our children, and all our possessions. For I was ashamed to ask the king for a band of soldiers and cavalry to protect us against the enemy on our way, since we had told the king that the hand of our God is gracious to all who seek him, but his power and his wrath are against all who forsake him. So we fasted and petitioned our God for this, and he listened to our entreaty. Then I set apart 12 of the leading priests, Sherebiah, Hashabiah, and 10 of their kin with them. And I weighed out to them the silver and the gold and the vessels, the offering for the house of our God, that the king, his counselors, his lords, and all Israel there present had offered. I weighed out into their hand 650 talents of silver and 100 silver vessels worth talents, and 100 talents of gold, 20 gold bowls worth 1,000 darics, and 2 vessels of fine polished bronze as precious as gold. And I said to them, you are holy to the Lord, and the vessels are holy, and the silver and the gold are a free will offering to the Lord, the God of your ancestors. Guard them and keep them until you weigh them before the chief priests and the Levites and the heads of families in Israel at Jerusalem, within the chambers of the house of the Lord. So the priests and the Levites took over the silver, the gold, and the vessels as they were weighed out, to bring them to Jerusalem, to the house of our God. Then we left the river Ahava on the 12th day of the first month to go to Jerusalem. The hand of our God was upon us, and he delivered us from the hand of the enemy and from ambushes along the way. We came to Jerusalem and remained there 3 days. On the 4th day, within the house of our God, the silver, the gold, and the vessels were weighed into the hands of the priest Meremoth, son of Uriah, and with him was Eleazar, son of Phinehas, and with them were the Levites, Jozabad, son of Jeshua, and Noadiah, son of Binnui. The total was counted and weighed, and the weight of everything was recorded. At that time, those who had come from captivity, the returned exiles, offered burnt offerings to the God of Israel, 12 bulls for all Israel, 96 rams, 77 lambs, and as a sin offering, 12 male goats. All this was a burnt offering to the Lord. They also delivered the king's commissions to the king's satraps and to the governors of the province beyond the river, and they supported the people and the house of God.
Okay, thank you. You did very well with all those names. Thank you.
Yeah. You're welcome. No lightning came down and blasted me away, so I guess it was okay.
No, of course. A couple things I want to say. I had been reading in my own footnotes in my study Bible that I never know quite on what authority do they say this, but they offer that the amounts of gold and silver were greatly exaggerated. And that they had to be exaggerated because the weight of 1 talent was 75 pounds.
Wow.
In other
What?
words, yeah. When they're talking about, you know,
I was going to ask if a talent was a coin.
no, when they're talking about 650 talents of silver and silver vessels, I mean, you're talking about, that's the kind of load that it would take a steam locomotive to move across the country. So it appears
They
that,
had a lot of parents and kids, all mentioned here, hundreds of them, maybe.
yeah, I mean, like I said, I don't ever know exactly why. He simply says the huge amounts listed defy credibility. Like, you just can't, sorry, that's not possible. We get it. You're trying to communicate that they had a lot of silver and a lot of gold. But that's not a lot. That's unimaginable. So, I mean, they were excited. So they exaggerated a little bit. Also, I guess you picked up on what's going on. Ezra is afraid to ask the king for a security detail to protect them as they traveled back to Jerusalem with all this gold, because he had reassured the king in Persia that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob would protect them. And so he felt like it was going to be a little bit of a contradiction if he went and asked the king for, you know, a detail of soldiers to make sure they arrive. And this is a lot of money, a lot of gold and silver and all
Yeah.
kind, and they're just traveling through the open country with it.
Didn't you really account for it being there 100%?
Yeah, and you know, highway robbers, I don't think they were rare. And so they prayed. They had a little church service before they left. And they prayed that God would, in fact, protect them. Again, the phrase is reminiscent of the pledge to Abraham and Sarah, where God said, "You walk with me, I'll walk with you, and I will establish a hedge around you." And so they offered a prayer to pray for the hedge. They wanted God to provide a hedge to deliver them from the hand of the enemy and from ambushes along the way. And so they made it, and they were not raided, and it was successful. The other thing that's pointed out that I think might go without realizing is, in verse 31, they're setting up, then we left the river Ahava on the 12th day of the first month to go to Jerusalem, and the hand of our God was upon us. The commentators are saying that the writer here is trying to create almost a recreation of the deliverance out of Egypt. And that this day that they're going to celebrate is going to be established as the Passover commemorating the Exodus, but it's 2 days earlier. It's not on the same day it used to be celebrated, because it's now going to be celebrated on this new day, which is marked out on the 4th day. And I guess the point is, this is, in some ways, there's a hearkening, there's a reckoning back to the great story of their own history, but they're also contemporizing it. You know, they're changing it so that it fits their circumstance, to say, look, the same God who answered the cries of the people in slavery is the same God who is now at work leading us out of the kinds of captivity we have seen and reestablishing Jerusalem and the covenant people. God is reenacting the deliverance in the Exodus.
Well, they have a literary flair.
Yes, yes, they do. It is. The writer is quite good. You know, and they're telling their story in a way that we often do. They're seeing it through the eyes of what's happening to them and who they are. And they're saying, oh, look here, this is God repeating what God has done for us. And you're going to see that the one thing they do is they tweak the old story a little bit to conform a little bit with what they think maybe might be an improvement on the kinds of things that the God of Exodus asked of them. And so they've arrived, they deliver the king's commissions to the king's satraps, and that's to the governors of the province beyond the river, and they are basically saying, here we are, the king gave us leave to be here, please don't bother us, because we're officially commissioned by the king on the other side of the river. All right, let's carry on, shall we?
Why not? Me again?
Yes.
I guess.
You
okay,
again.
I get it. All right. After these things had been done, the officials approached me and said, the people of Israel, the priests and the Levites, have not separated themselves from the peoples of the lands with their abominations, from the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Egyptians, and the Amorites. For they have taken some of their daughters as wives for themselves and for their sons. Thus the holy seed has mixed itself with the people of the lands, and in this faithlessness the officials and the leaders have led the way. When I heard this, I tore my garment and my mantle, and pulled my hair from my head and beard, and sat appalled. Then all who trembled at the words of the God of Israel, because of the faithlessness of the returned exiles, gathered around me while I sat appalled until the evening sacrifice. At the evening sacrifice, I got up from my fasting with my garments and my mantle torn, and fell on my knees, spread out my hands to the Lord my God, and said, Oh my God, I am too ashamed and embarrassed to lift my face to you, my God, for our iniquities have risen higher than our heads, and our guilt has mounted up to the heavens. From the days of our ancestors to this day, we have been deep in guilt, and for our inequities, we, our kings and our priests, have been handed over to the kings of the lands, to the sword, to captivity, to plundering, and to utter shame, as is now the case. But now, for a brief moment, favor has been shown by the Lord our God, who has left us a remnant and given us a stake in this holy place, in order that he may brighten our eyes and grant us a little substance in our slavery. A little substance?
Yes.
Really? Okay.
All right.
That's
Yeah.
good.
For we are slaves, yet our God has not forsaken us in our slavery, but has extended to us his steadfast love before the kings of Persia, to give us new life, to set up the house of our God, to repair its ruins, and to give us a wall in Judea and Jerusalem. And now, our God, what shall we say after this? For we have forsaken your commandments, which you commanded by your servants, the prophets, saying, the land that you are entering to possess is a land unclean with the pollutions of the peoples of the lands with their abominations. They have filled it from end to end with their uncleanness. Therefore, do not give your daughters to their sons, neither take their daughters for your sons, and never seek their peace or prosperity, so that you may be strong and eat the good of the land and leave it for an inheritance to your children forever. After all that has come upon us for our evil deeds and for our great guilt, seeing that you, our God, have punished us less than our iniquities deserved, and have given us such a remnant as this, shall we break your commandments again and intermarry with the peoples who practice these abominations? Would you not be angry with us until you destroy us without remnant or survivor? O Lord God of Israel, you are just, but we have escaped as a remnant, as is now the case. Here we are before you in our guilt, though no one can face you because of this.
Ah, yeah. Isn't that just sweet writing?
Sure.
Hi, Judy.
Hi, everybody. I'm sorry
Hello.
to be late. Hello. Sorry to be late. All right.
So, what do you think of Ezra's first act of leadership here? They're all set up in the temple, and he gets up in the pulpit, and before he gets in the pulpit, he falls on his face in the temple and offers up a conversation to God. What do you think?
What chapter? I'm sorry.
Oh,
What
chapter 9. We just finished reading chapter
Ezra
9.
chapter 9.
Yep.
Thank you. Yeah.
Sort of ironic to have to bring in all the gold and silver and all that kind of stuff to the land of the Israel people, per se, and to be united. And then all of a sudden you get this monkey wrench of all the dead weight that came along with it. And now how do you explain that to God, right?
Yeah, I mean, he basically is saying, even that phrase where he says we are prisoners, he's acknowledging that they're still under the Persian Empire.
Sure.
They're not an independent people. So they're prisoners, but that God has somehow managed, while they are prisoners, to sneak in a few extra blessings to them as a sign of it keeps using this word remnant. The remnant, are you familiar with that phrase, remnant? Like a remnant is,
The leftover.
yeah, it's like when
What's
God,
left?
yeah, when God releases God's punishment on a group of people, there may be a few people that survive to maybe clean up their act, and that's a remnant. That is, there's a lot throughout Jewish theology. There's a lot of remnant theology, which is that God always preserves a remnant. God always preserves something, and God will never wipe out the whole of creation when the flood.
Yeah, like Noah.
Exactly.
Right?
Noah was a
Yeah.
remnant. He was a keeper of, enough to keep the race alive, but maybe enough to be able to work it into a new direction. And throughout Israel's history, throughout Jewish history, there have always been groups of people who have perceived themselves as a remnant of the true community. That everybody else is, has watered it down or has somehow squandered it away, but that God has preserved them as a remnant of the true community. And so they become, they become the force of God at work in the world.
Is that like the Hasidic community?
Yes.
Yeah. We read about. Yeah.
And it's, it's interesting that, I don't know how much we know as Christians about this idea of a remnant, but one of the ideas that emerged in Jewish theology was that the whole world didn't need to be faithful. The whole community didn't need to be faithful. But that, if you remember the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, where God makes the deal with Lot and says, if you just find 10 righteous people, I'll save the whole of the city. And Abraham can't find even 10 people. So then he says, what about 5? That's God looking for a remnant, for just one faithful group of people. And I'll see if I can say this in simple ways. their faithfulness will be multiplied out on behalf of the whole world. Now, Christians should understand something of that concept, because the death of Jesus on the cross has been interpreted in Christian theology as he died for the sins of the whole world. And so Jesus' life was the remnant of God. So it wasn't 10 people, it wasn't 5 people, it was Jesus. And because he always obeyed and he always was faithful, that I'm going to use the biblical language and then we can talk about what does it mean. His righteousness is imputed to the whole world. So he was faithful to the end. In the garden, he says, let this cup pass from me, but if not, then not my will, but your will. He becomes what is known as, in Jewish theology, as the righteous remnant. And in Jewish theology, they always believed, in many sects still believe, that if just the right number of people in the world would for one day, if the right number of people would for one whole day conform their lives to the law of God, then the whole world would be saved. But that's called the remnant theology. Now, I don't know enough about the Hasid to know whether they believe their faithfulness is imputed to the rest of the world, or whether they believe more like some Christians who think, they've looked in the book of Revelation and they think there's only, 10,000 people in the end that are ever going to be saved. And then, you want to try to be one of those 10,000 because the rest are going to be, burned up. That's not righteous remnant. That's just like, we're going to survive and the rest of you are going to be gone. This is the left behind theology. That the good people, the people who are obedient, or even the people that claim Jesus as their Savior, he covers their sin. So at the end of time, God's going to come down in a big vacuum sweeper and suck the good ones up, and take them off to some better place, while God then works out terrible days of suffering and vengeance against all the rest of the population of the world.
Well, there you go.
Yeah, so let me just take a poll. Which of those do you believe?
I believe the third way.
Yeah.
In Islam, it's much more egalitarian.
Yeah.
If you walk the path that the prophets, especially Jesus and Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, set out for you, if you're walking in the way, in the Sirat al-Mustaqim, there you go. You have achieved righteousness. You don't have to be son of this one or related to that one. You don't have to claim that Jesus died for us on the cross. You just have to follow the way of Jesus and the prophets. That's kind of more in line with the way I think. I don't know.
I like that.
If that's a third way out,
That
I
idea.
don't know. I think the Hasidim really, the Hasidic Jews consider themselves the most pious of Jews, and they cling to all the ritual, which gives them an edge on the rest of Judaism and the rest of the world. And I don't think they take into account Christianity in that reckoning. But the appeal of Jesus being the sacrifice for us, becoming one with God, becoming one with humanity, is an appealing thing. I just don't have to get it. But,
Yeah, and I'd say, I think it's unfortunate that in most of our Christian education, we've always been told, here is the Christian thing, or we've been told this is the Christianity that's based on the Old Testament. But, you know, one of the most interesting, I guess I'll just call it ideas, was that in Jewish theology, especially developing now during this time, but Jewish theology, the idea of the suffering servant. The suffering servant was an idea that, yes, the world is broken. The world is a broken and horrible place. But that some of us are called, not in the language of the blessing to be a blessing, but that some of us are called to actually absorb and take on ourselves the suffering of the world in order that it might be redeemed. And so the suffering servant wasn't a one person. It's servant, but it's plural. It's like when you use the word...
I thought that's why they had the goats.
Yes, but
I'm actually
true.
trying to be funny, but
No, it's
you
true.
know,
But
wasn't that the substitution for actual human
yes,
suffering? Was you're going to sacrifice the goats, and they're the sin offering?
yes, but the suffering servant theology emerged in a time when some of the sacrificial system was not sufficient to explain the reality that they were living in.
Right.
And so all of these things, these themes or these ideas, many of them are still here with us today. You don't recognize them, but they're very much a part of the hymns that we sing, of the stories that we've been told about the meaning of the Bible. And this idea emerges as a way of answering the question, why, like, what is evil and what are we supposed to do about it? You know, for the Jews that remained faithful believers after the encampments of the Nazis, there were rabbis who began to explain that the suffering of the Jewish people, the intense suffering, was in some ways, they were taking, here's the Christian language sneaking in, taking on themselves the sin of the whole world. And their suffering was producing righteousness in the great cosmic sense of the imbalance of, you know, here's the good things and the bad things seem to be better and stronger. But by suffering yourself, you're not just taking on the brokenness. There's a lot of, my mind is racing now, but you know, a lot of people in the pacifist movement believe that if you are committed to hardline pacifism, you will have to suffer. You will suffer, but your willingness to absorb that suffering will ultimately lead, and I don't know how this works out, but it will lead to a more righteous world.
But in the example that you mentioned, what about the concept of evil? Is that just dismissed?
It's not, it's not dismissed, and that's why I say I go to brokenness. You know, there's evil in the world. It's not, for most of the Hebrew theology, it's not personified. It's not the devil. That's a fringe idea. But that there's brokenness in the biblical families. I mean, look at the family. Look at the family of Abraham and Isaac. Look at them. Their family is full of the brokenness and the hurt of human existence. And
This
question.
This jazz, though, that Ezra's given you here is let's be so pious now that we've arrived and we've got the blessing of being the remnant and we can carry on. Let's do evil to our own people to fight this supposed evil that we see. It makes no sense to me. Ezra's I think, on the wrong path. You can't perpetrate evil on people to try and mitigate evil. It's like my dad used to say, 2 wrongs don't make a right. Yeah. Please, Ezra, you're going down the wrong path here.
And do we have brokenness with evil?
I do. I do. I mean, evil sometimes is easier to attach to human beings, but I think of the brokenness, the suffering that exists in the world, systems of the world that cause heartache, disease, for example. You know, I don't personalize disease, and I think it's evil, but I prefer to talk about it as a brokenness. There's a brokenness in the system. There has been from the very beginning, and it's acknowledged by God. This is not a perfect world. You know, the Socrates and some of the Greek philosophers argued that what we perceive as evil is actually a part of a perfect world. You know, because in a perfect world, you have to have evil or you would never know the good. You know.
So that would explain what's going on in Ukraine, the evil in terms of what's happening to these people. Is that a brokenness, or is that? I just want to know the distinction between the two.
What I think is what's happening in Ukraine is an unfolding of a central brokenness that can take root in anybody's life, and that is the inordinate need for power, money, fame, and wealth and control. You can have the Putin problem can break out in nations, and it can also break out at the family dinner table. You know, it's a characteristic of us as human beings. Now, I want to get to one comment I want to make, because Barbara, I want you to know I didn't forget about your comment from last week, and I've been thinking about it all week. And you might remember that you said, look, I don't get this. So now here's Ezra and Nehemiah, and they're arguing that now God is doing all these good things because of so-and-so in the lives of the people, right? And if I got your comment right last week, you were saying, I'm not all that excited about thinking about God as being like this. God punishing nations because they behave in a certain way, or God rewarding nations because they, you know, behave in a certain way. And I'm only just coming back to say, I agree with you. Like, I don't think it's a good way of understanding. Because that's the slippery slope that Ezra is entering into right here. Ezra is saying, look, we've got tons of gold, we have tons of silver. Look at us. Oh my gosh, a miracle has occurred. We must be doing something right, or we must be somebody that God wants to honor and favor. And he moves right from that statement, we are the remnant of the righteous people, to then saying, now I want you to go home, and I want you to make sure you remove everybody from what you think of as your family who isn't really part of your family.
Right.
Klingons.
Okay.
Yeah, Klingons, exactly.
That's not exactly being a blessing. I think he's deluded into thinking that if you stay racially pure, you're doing what God wants you to do. But, no. And he already had the Samaritans coming forth and saying, let us help you.
Yep.
That would have been good. He's got neighbors to the left, neighbors to the right that, you know, if you actually communed with them, you might become friends and you might appreciate each other instead of making war on each other. I think he's doing I see people around us today looking for answers when bad things happen. And unfortunately, some of these answers become cruelty to other people.
Yeah.
Also, I'm thinking of the suffering servant is something that is still, I think of it in terms of Christian martyrdom. And there are, I know, groups of Catholics, priests, that believe that if you whip yourself or whatever, the more you suffer, the more godly you are, or the closer to God you are. So that's not just the Jews.
No, and No,
the
certainly not.
And it's in Islam too. The Shiites do the self-scourging as well. You know, I don't know. There's a strong current of that through all the religions, I guess, to feel that to make yourself worthy of God's love, you have to suffer.
right.
And I think that's where a lot of the occults come from too.
Right.
When you think that they get a group of people and they're looking for something that they can't find in their own religion and their own family, own communities, they hang on to something, and it's an undercurrent of the same thing. Somewhere down the line, you know, they think if I suffer enough, if somebody hits me because I didn't do what they wanted me to do, then that's okay. You know, they get to the point where they have no self-esteem or any hope. They just they sort of follow along, you know, and
Yeah.
they think they're being saved because mentally they're going to jump off the cliff because somebody else did.
Right, and I think in the fullest sense of the idea of suffering servant, and I think you're right in the naming of all of these self-flagellating, you know, people who believe that, you know, the right thing is to punish themselves. But in order to get the full mindset of the suffering servant, there has to be an element that says, I'm suffering, I'm going to be beaten or whatever, I'm suffering, but it's not just for me. That my suffering is for the welfare of others. That makes it a righteous kind of thing. Now, if I can move from the great national scene and just move down to families, family systems therapists will find the suffering servant in families oftentimes. The suffering servant is the child who doesn't speak up about the inequities or the abuse or the violence that they see in the house. And when they grow up and someone says, why didn't you tell somebody? They say, well, if I had told somebody, then the family would have been blown apart and we'd all gone off to foster care. So they're suffering in order to benefit the whole family. And if you put that on a cosmic level, this theology sees God as honoring your willingness to suffer, and therefore, I can't get past this word, imputes righteousness to those who aren't righteous, but makes them righteous, so that other people can piggyback on your righteousness in your suffering. Now, this concept was very important in the theology of Jesus. It's extremely important in terms of understanding who Jesus, who the theologians of the 3rd and 4th and 5th century thought of Jesus as. And yet it's also in the New Testament a little bit, because this suffering servant theme, we'll get to it later on, but you hear it in the Psalms, you're going to hear it in Isaiah, that there is this idea that, you know, that God is saving the world by some of us taking on the suffering of the world. And
So,
yeah, go ahead.
so does that, as a corollary of that, does it mean that suffering connects people?
Yeah. Well, suffering, yes, it connects the sufferer to the world. Like, you know, think of those images. Jesus took upon himself the sins of the whole world. You think about that, right? We get used to hearing that and saying it, and we think we know what we mean by it. But, you know, Jesus was the Messiah, but he was the strangest Messiah ever recorded in Jewish history, because there are two kinds of people who will save us. The one person is the traditional sense of Messiah is they would come as a warrior and they would throw off the occupying armies and they would establish through military might God's reign on earth. Okay, that's the purest sense of the of the expectation and the hope of Messiah. But in Jesus, in the theology of Jesus, Jesus put together the image of the Messiah and the suffering servant. In other words, Jesus said, yes, I am a Messiah, but my salvation for the world will not come the way you expect it. He goes to Pontius Pilate and he says, I lay down my life. I give myself to the whip of the Romans, and I die on the cross in obedience to God, and then my righteousness, my willingness to be the perfect human is ultimately then the remedy for all the brokenness that humans have done. He's the Savior of the world. Think about how familiar we are with Jesus being described like that, but we've not really ever heard the background behind that. He is the Savior of the world. By his...
Do you really think that Jesus wanted to take that role on?
No.
Or was he just trying to say, follow what I'm doing. Do not raise your hand against your fellow. Do not steal, do not cheat. Love God and love your neighbors. And that is not something that people in power want to hear. So he knew he was setting himself up as the enemy of the power. But I think right up to the end, he knew he had to go on with that mission. He felt strongly enough about it. But I think he would have been just as happy if they said, you know what, you're going to be exiled to Elba and we won't see you for a while. I think he would have probably tried to stay and still have a following, which would have kept him, again, in constant tension with the powers that be. But I don't think he thought, ooh, please kill me, because I really don't see that. I don't know. Maybe I'm completely wrong.
No, then I think about when he was asking God, do you really want to give me this cup to drink, that kind of thing? If not, please take it away. Yeah. He was sort of knowing what his fate was, but yet he still was human enough to not want to see it too. You know what I mean?
I often say, I don't believe for a minute that Jesus committed suicide.
Yeah.
No, I don't either. I'm just saying that it's just that if he was supposed to be like man, we all have our doubts and we all have our fears. And no matter if he is the Son of God and knows that he's going to do all this good, that humanness in him too, I think, kicks in too, just like it would for the rest of us.
Just listening to what was just said, and Debbie, was his role was predetermined. The role was predetermined then, yeah. And accepted.
So I never know what to do when you say that, and then I go, no, I don't want to say that. I'm not saying that's not right, but I still believe that human beings, Jesus included, we're free agents. Mm-hmm. And I think the reason that Jesus is such an appeal to me personally, why am I a follower of Jesus, is it's not a supernatural thing. It's I look at Jesus and I see what I think he would describe not as his way, but as the way of God in the world. Right. He describes the way of God, and he doesn't just describe it, he lives it.
He lives it. And that idea that people have had, like Jesus turned the other cheek, he was weak, he was submissive, he was anything but that. He could have gone away and disappeared from, current politics in, the Roman Empire, but he didn't. He persevered with what he felt was his mission of righteousness, knowing that it was going to get him into trouble, and he didn't back up. He didn't back away from it. But I don't know that he figured, okay, cool, kill me. That'll make a lot of difference. He probably thought, whatever happens, though, this is my mission. And I have to carry on.
I think about it in terms of people that are contemporaries in our lifetime. You know, you read the stories of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. before he was killed. And, you know, he said to his family and friends, I have this impending sense, you know, that the world is not going to tolerate this message that I am bringing. And he was right. Like, you know, but he did not want to die. He didn't. But he had a path that he was called to walk, that he believed he was called to walk. And he also believed he couldn't do otherwise. He was advised to turn away and whatever. So I think about Jesus in that way. Now, we haven't yet discussed what in classic Christian theology is the mark of the distinction of Jesus in his resurrection. You know, he did not go to die. He went to death to be raised again from the dead. And I, you know, I still have trouble articulating exactly where I am with this, but I think the promise of Jesus, I read this scripture passage at funerals all the time, and I always want to look at the faces of people and think, what do you think this means? Those who lived and believed in me will never die. What? And those who have died will live again. And I really don't mean to take anything out of the factual, objective history of the resurrection of Jesus, but I'm sorry, I've looked at the New Testament accounts of Jesus' resurrection, and what I hear was that in the power imputed to him because he walked in the way of love and of mercy and of grace, and he did so even in the face of death, that after his death, he reappeared. And that's what resurrection means. He didn't, like Lazarus was dead for 3 days in the tomb, and then they went in, they unwrapped him, and he came out and he sat down and he ate, and Lazarus had to die again. That's how I think a lot of people think the doctrine of the resurrection of Jesus was understood in the first century. I don't think so. I think, if you could imagine, now bear with me, I'm testing us out for the very first time, but if you can imagine the power of life and the power of trust in God that was coursing through Jesus' veins. He lived and died every day in faith in God. And the experience of that faith led to the place where after he was dead, he was, I don't know what else to say, he was resurrected. He was seen again. The power of his life could not be extinguished by the powers that we know that cause death.
We don't know the names of those Roman soldiers who nailed him on the cross, but we certainly know Jesus.
Right.
We certainly speak about Jesus and his way and what he said and what he did. And millions and billions, I don't know how many billions of Christians and Muslims are there that revere Jesus today.
And what do we mean, really? What do we mean when on Easter we sing this song, He lives? He lives, He lives. He is alive today. I think what we mean when we say that is the same thing they meant when they said it. It's, when I get up on Easter Sunday and we do the Easter acclamation, He is risen indeed. We're not looking around the sanctuary for His body. We're not. But at Easter, what we are looking for is the continuation of His life in us and in the world. That's the resurrected community. And I think that's what it means when Paul says, those who believe in Jesus will never die. There is a life, there is an infusion of life that comes, and it exists in defiance of everything that kills us. Which then, throughout history, you see these people all the time. They're faced with I don't know, my mind goes immediately to a very personal illustration of my own father. You know, my father knew he was dying for 5 days before he died. And it's weird because 2 years leading up to my father's death, he was obsessed with what I would call a sense of fear about death. He wanted answers to where my mother had gone. He's a preacher. He was reading books. You know, there are people who've written books about what heaven is like. Did you know that? and I would laugh at him. I'd come in, I'd see the book there, and I'd get, Dad, did you really give $15 to somebody who's going to tell you what heaven is like? I mean, come on.
I mean, they saw the light, came back and wrote a book.
Yeah, exactly. They know it. And yet, so for a year and a half, my father was absorbed with a very dark kind of a thought about, you know, is there a heaven? Is there even a God? Is there, like, all that? And then 5 days, really, before my father died, he entered into, at first we thought it was drugs from the doctor. And the doctor was like, nope, not giving him anything. He entered into this state of heart. It's a state of mind. And I don't know how else to describe it, but I had the experience that I was with a resurrected person who hadn't died yet. Now, I've never heard anybody say that before, but I will tell you, it was like, for him, you know, they say in funerals, oh, for him, death is past, you know, pain is ended. And it happened for him before he died. And to me, I said this in his funeral, I felt like he was given the gift of the resurrection. And he was calm. In fact, he kind of became like a stand-up comedian. You know, he was so happy. He was so filled with contentment and a resolve in his life. And the whole family remarked about it, like, what has happened to him? And, you know, on the last day of his life, he was in a hospital bed in the living room in his house, and we had him sort of propped up, and we knew he was going to die, and so he has a massive family, like there's hundreds. And they were parading in, you know, they're coming in to say goodbye, and it was very tearful, you know, to look at this man and say goodbye to him. He was living. And after one session, my brother had come in with his big family, and they'd gone through all their weeping, and they're saying goodbye, and he looked at me and he goes, is there a button around here I could push, and then it would be over? Like, is there a button? And it was just, it wasn't hostile, it was just, this is it. The convergence of life and death together in those moments. And it was powerful. And I wonder if that isn't more of what the disciples in the upper room experienced after they had seen the brutality of a crucifixion of Jesus. It was awful. And yet they go back to hide in the room, and the phrase is very clear. It's not the words that were used of Lazarus. It says there where they were in the upper room, and he appeared to them. And he was not a ghost, but he made several appearances. And I don't want to push the language of English any further than that, except to say that somehow that all fits into this as well. Whatever Jesus' way is, however you read and you try to understand Jesus' way and the way of the communities that came into existence following him, this is the way of God in the world. And it is the pathway to life. Life here and now, and life in the after now, in whatever comes next. It's still the same pathway. So I know, to me, that sounds very much like my own personal statement, because that's not how it's explained to me anywhere else. So I'm giving you that caveat to say, that's not what I was told. I was told that Jesus is sort of like the secret word you have to say to unlock the door to a room that only certain people will get in. If you say the right...
That's more like Ezra. You have to be the certain people to gain entry instead of being making it your faith all encompassing. He's narrowing it down again. And I don't think that was Jesus's mission, just the opposite.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Or,
Just my opinion. I don't know.
or was it what God wants? My God.
Yeah,
I don't know about
right.
your God. But my God.
You mentioned something about how the horror of what the disciples saw towards the end of Jesus' life and everything. But we know what happened to Judas. We hear about Peter and his denial. But you don't really, and James, I guess, was one of them, being with the mother Mary. But what happened to all the other ones? You don't really hear about them really being on the pathway or watching their leader taking his final trips. Did they actually become part of the crowd, or did they hide because they were afraid? Which is sort of what Peter was afraid of, admitting he was part of the group. But you never hear about the rest of them. You only hear about Judas killed himself after betrayal. Peter denied, but I don't know. It seems like until they get back to the room where Jesus shows up again, I take it back. The women that couldn't find Jesus in the garden and stuff too, but you don't really hear about, let's say, all 10 of them. What did they do during this time period,
Yeah. I think Acts describes that what they did was they basically all returned to who they were before Jesus came. Peter and James and John, they went back to fishing. They all tried to return to something as life before Jesus, but that ultimately the church's experience, now we have to start talking about this thing called the Holy Spirit, but that something else came. Something else was unleashed among them. It turned them from cowards into great heroes. And, Peter found his own reconciliation and became a leader of the church, as did, and in particular, the ones who never really abandoned him were the women. They were the women who appeared at the cross, and then the ones who became the proclaimers first and said, look, we have experienced the risen Lord.
Out of the 12, though, Peter and James were both martyred.
Right.
But they were the only ones. And then if you're going to count Paul,
Right.
he counts
But he
himself.
wasn't really a disciple per se.
Well, he counts himself
Yeah,
as
I
a.
was going to say, don't tell him that.
But those were the only ones we don't know, I don't think, what happened to.
Or weren't they
You know.
supposed to learn all these different languages and go out and preach to all the areas? But you don't really hear about their adventures. You don't hear about their chapter after Jesus, or from the moment they disappeared and then they came back. You just, like you said, if they went back to fishing and doing what they were doing before, but had the pull to come back, where were they doing the worst time of Jesus's final steps,
I think that where you have to go to hear those stories is sort of in the after Bible period. You have to go and read about the history of the expansion of the Christian church, because the worldwide expansion of the church out of Jerusalem was phenomenal, and it became history changing. And when you read the history, the extra biblical history, you learn that all those disciples and apostles became part of planting churches. They became part of creating the known world experience and expansion of the Christian church. The most famous one, and the one that did more of that spreading, is Paul, because he traveled outside the Holy Land.
The Gentiles and
Yeah,
so forth.
he went out and reached out to the Gentiles, but also, Mark, in Egypt, Mark, who you don't read much about really in the Bible, but Mark went south to northern Egypt and founded the Coptic church. And still to this day, the Coptic church will tell you that when they gather for worship, the liturgy that they use was written by the Apostle Mark, and it's still in the Coptic original language. And that church, you know, worldwide, the Coptic Christian church is huge. And so there are historical experiences of people who had been around the campfire of Jesus. I don't know how else to explain it. But they had sat around the campfire with Jesus, and they had tasted the broiled fish, and they had come back together, and they were sent out in an amazing movement that went worldwide. And what did it create? It created the most inclusive, welcoming, loving, justice-seeking communities that the world had ever known. And it didn't have much of this attitude of Ezra to say, well, now before we go overboard with welcoming all these people into this new community, maybe we ought to do a little genealogical study on them and find out whether or not they're, you know, whether they're our
worthy.
people or not. You know, the book of Acts says that on one day, 2,000 people joined the movement. And I want to know who did the vetting. You know, who checked their backgrounds? Who made sure they weren't this horrible description? I'm sorry, but I think an example of how Ezra, just as one example, but it happens in biblical witness over and over and over again, Ezra goes back, and on the authority of Moses, he's appealing to the authority of Moses. And I challenge anybody to find where Moses said these kinds of things. Did you catch this? And now, God, what shall we say? After we have forsaken your commandments, which you commanded by your servants, the land that you are entering to possess is a land unclean with pollutions of the people of the lands. When did Moses ever say that? And then with their abominations. Wow, Ezra. I mean, I think maybe, you know, you're taking the caution. Moses said, when you get in the land, be careful that you remember who you are, and that you practice your ways, and that you remember that I am your God, and you not get deceived into forgetting who I am and how you came to be. Ezra, his version of it is, these people with their abominations, they have filled the earth from end to end with their uncleanness. This is a rationalization for genocide, which is being laid here.
Yeah.
Do not give your daughters to their sons, neither take their daughters for your sons. And did you catch this? Never seek their peace. Never seek their peace. Wow.
Harsh.
I mean, after all that God has brought upon us for our evil deeds and our great guilt, seeing that you and our God have punished us less than our iniquities deserved, shall we now break these commandments again and intermarry with people who practice these abominations? I told you, I kept telling you Ezra was going here, right?
Yeah.
He was headed
The
here.
dark side.
You alert.
But Ezra thinks he's right. Ezra believes in what he's saying. And that's the scary part.
Yes. I mean, you know, and some of this was a part of the debate or the issue when they were moving into the promised land, and they would come across certain peoples, and then, you know, somebody, Samuel or somebody, would hear the voice of God saying, go in and kill them all, you know, all their women and all their children, and by the way, kill all their animals too, because, you know, whatever the contamination these people brought, they probably infected their animals with it as well. So make sure you know, just scorch the earth. I continue to believe that those kinds of experiences were just like Ezra. What, pardon my French, but what the hell gets into people that they believe the only way forward or the only way up is the result of standing on the necks or jumping on the necks of other people? You know, you're not going to get ahead in this world till you push somebody down. And, what were these contaminations and abominations? People had different practices. They had different religious practices. It's I personally believe that what was at the heart even of the best of Moses's cautions about people was that getting ahead through greed and injustice is seductive. It's extremely seductive. And I think the better sense of understanding the caution to the people of God who were supposed to be a blessing to the people of the earth was a caution that they not get infected with the kinds of thoughts that, are a part of everybody in the world, I guess. I don't know. Somehow Cyrus in Persia was...
But not saying that because somebody's born in a certain part of the world, or the story of the Good Samaritan refutes that.
It
The
does.
Samaritan may not be what Ezra's thinking of as a righteous person, but he's the only one who acts in a godly way, who's being a blessing to his neighbors. Which one, Jesus is saying, is the more righteous? Really. It seems kind of like a no-brainer, but you get caught up in this thing. Our tribe against yours, my side against the other side. We always want to label somebody
The upper
as
hand.
other, and then we have somebody to take up righteous arms against. Humanity loves this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
It always brings grief, and we're all susceptible to it.
It continues.
You think about the illustrations in Scripture, just from the big stories that we know. I'm fighting a sneeze right now, so bear with me. But you think about how many times in their own story, it was not the pure and the blood-tested. But, I always go back to say, who was it that saved Moses' life? Oh, it was the Egyptian Pharaoh's daughter. She wasn't a pureblood. She wasn't one of the people. She saved Moses' life. And by the way, when Jesus was threatened by Herod, who saved Jesus' life? He fled to Egypt. He went to Egypt and found sanctuary and protection in Egypt among these, let's see, how are they described? They are people who have their abominations and pollutions filling the earth from end to end with their uncleanness. Whoops.
Yeah.
I guess, and people love to hate Egypt, but Egypt, and think of the story in the beginning. Jacob arrived in Egypt. Joseph had been taken there in slavery, yes. But it wasn't the hostility of the Egyptians that put him in slavery. It was his own brothers.
Brothers, right?
And so he arrives in Egypt, and what happens while he's in Egypt? He finds
He
favor.
rises up.
He finds favor, and he becomes a celebrated person. Where are all these abominations and uncleanness and all the rest of it in the world? It's not there. So I guess this is it. This is where Ezra, like other human beings, is making himself and those who follow him feel better by putting everybody else down and arguing that God agrees.
Mm.
Not only that God agrees, but that it's God's will, and that God is orchestrating it.
Yeah.
God is the one telling him. God, this is God's word, not my word.
Yeah, and maybe the slippery slope begins when Cyrus has this amazing, generous heart, and the people begin to benefit from Cyrus's generosity. Maybe it begins right there. Maybe the seed of the future, awfulness begins, and this goes back to Barbara's comment. What if the first mistake that was made was the assumption that Cyrus's kindness and generosity was a sign of God's blessing or forgiveness toward the people of Israel? What if that is not how God relates to people? So they start to receive this gold and the blessing and the building materials, and they see their family coming back together, and all of a sudden, what gets rekindled? What gets rekindled is the idea that God likes us better than other people.
Yeah, and even in our own family, God likes certain of us better than others.
Yeah.
It's awful.
And
Oh, well.
and
My
while
mother always liked you better.
yeah, that's right.
Oh,
And while the truth it's more boring in some ways, but the truth may just be, you know, that crass bumper sticker that says shit happens? Like, I actually believe in the philosophy that is behind that statement. The 12-step movement says it this way: you'll have this. In this world, you will have this. You will have brokenness. You will have meanness. You will have, Judy's word, you will have evil. You will. And that bumper sticker and that saying from 12-step movement tries to knock you off the perch of trying to find the cause of it. Why is it this way? Why am I suffering today, and why am I not suffering tomorrow? Stop thinking like that. Accept it. And that's why I like the word brokenness. You accept the brokenness of life, and you look it in the face, and you go, all right, what do I need to do? What can I do today to own and to bring into my own life something of goodness? Because sitting around trying to answer the question, where did evil come from? That question is usually being asked by people who want to find out who the evil people are, and they're ready to go out and exterminate them.
there you go. We can read Ezra and say, oh my gosh, we're so much better than Ezra, because, we're not, speaking evil about other people, but I do. I do it all the time.
I do too.
And I forget that, here's the example. Are you listening to what the Bible is saying? Yeah, for Ezra, not for me.
Right.
Yeah.
That's the caution here, is that you don't hear your own story in these stories.
Right.
I'd like to today, are you listening to that fake news, or are you listening to common sense?
Yeah. The common sense indicator would be a lot more helpful today across the
Exactly.
board, no matter where it is. But I also think, where we've gotten so far, it leads me to be able to say something I've had trouble describing too. I don't know, maybe you'll think I'm just really not, you just can't please me. But I also, my skin crawls a little bit when people, especially going into November and coming up to the time of Thanksgiving, and people will start to talk about all these blessings that God has given me. And I always want to say, just pump the brakes a little bit on that, okay? Because your better circumstance in life, the fact that you have more money or you have food or that, your family's been relatively healthy, I say pump the brakes a little bit on your statement that these are the blessings of God. Because if you don't pump the brakes on that, then you make an implication for those who have, they got 6 members in their family and 5 of them are dying. Well, what is that then? If this is the blessings of God, then are not these the curses of God? And that's why I say, I get it. Gratitude, it's irreplaceable. But be careful. Be careful in how you receive the good things of life. Because I don't believe, I've told you this before, the biggest work in my younger days when my congregation was 900 families and I was everywhere in all these stations of people's lives, the biggest battle I fought, I always felt was, I'd be with families. When is the minister called? The minister is called usually when bad things are happening. And when I walk through the door of the house or the hospital room or the ambulance or whatever, and bad things have happened, then the question is, why are these things happening to me? And the worry is this God trying to communicate with me somehow that I've done something wrong or you have regrets? And I always said, be careful. Be careful, because nobody ever called me to the house when Dad got a raise, of 50% more than what he was making last week. They never called me to the house to sit around and have a conference about what does this mean. Because we all know what it means, right? We know that God is pleased with us. God is happy with us. And I go, no, it can't be that way. It can't be. We need to stop thinking about the experiences of life as if this is how God rewards us. You do right, you live right, God will reward you with, a home and a house, and you won't be unemployed like everybody else and all the rest of that. And I'm not saying that everybody who gives thanks to God for the good things in their life feels that. Remember my phrase, pump the brakes, because be careful. Be cautious about how you see or understand the good things that come in life. Because if you're not careful, then if something happens and those good things are all of a sudden gone, you're left with a horrible assumption. And the horrible assumption is that God is now trying to punish you.
So the basic assumption then is an acceptance of the brokenness of life?
Say that again.
I said, so the assumption then is that there should be an acceptance of the brokenness of life, and then therefore you're prepared to accept. I mean, acceptance is a big word. I remember once having lunch with Chief Roy Crazy Horse of the Powhatan tribe, and trying to explain a particular situation. And I'll never forget, he just said, you analyze too much, just accept. A big word, accept.
Really hard word.
Yeah. The brokenness, perhaps if people set out, to accept brokenness, then a lot of these other, pieces would fall into place.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I had a very helpful therapist early in my struggle of living this life who looked at me. He got to know me a little bit. He said, Lou, you're operating under some really false pretenses in life. And I was like, really? Like what? He said, if you dig down a couple inches in life, you'll find chaos, not order, not wonderful design and plan and all the rest of that. There was that great Christian metaphor that was given that, we experience life like the underside of a tapestry. You look at the underside of the tapestry, you see nothing. But if you could see what God sees, you see this great, ordered, beautiful landscape in the tapestry of the rug. What this man, who was a Lutheran chaplain, pastor, therapist, was saying is, you got to let go of some of that. Because you cannot put piece and piece of puzzle together. It doesn't work like that. For all of Genesis' claim that God spoke into creation and brought order out of chaos, it never says that God removed all the chaos. There is order in life. There is. There are systems that work, and there's orderliness in our love and the way of a state, but it only goes a couple inches deep. And if you dig too deep, you're going to find chaos. And to me, that's part of what, again, I keep going back to what I think is the profound wisdom of the 12-step movement. In those first meetings of Bill W. and others in England, they came to a common confession that it did not help their sanity at all to be pursuing this great plan of God. but that instead, a much more, like what you said, Judy, when you started, was to say that maybe then the encouragement is to just take life as it comes. To accept it. That's very Buddhist, by the way. You know, it's very much like live into this moment. Jesus himself said, "Let the worries of tomorrow be dealt with tomorrow." Live into today. Today is the day of urgency. But not to look back in great cause and effect, or to look ahead for premonitions of what is about to come, but look at how the birds live. Look at how the beasts of the field live. They live for today, for the moment of today.
So,
Go ahead.
no, so when you say, put a damper on the weeks, maybe that's a part of it too, but that also looks at how good is it to analyze or to try to understand. I mean, what's the halfway point between acceptance and process, of life, of questioning?
Okay. So that's going to
That's
quote.
a whole new chapter.
Well,
Yeah.
in a way it is and it isn't, because I'll just quote for you the Serenity Prayer. Nobody ever knows who wrote it, but it's God, let me see the things I can change. And let me know the things I can't change. And give me the wisdom to know the difference between them.
So that answers the question of where inquiry, starts and stops and acceptance begins.
Well, it has to do with acceptance, but it also has to do with recognizing that in this broken world, we're not passive. We don't have to be passive. There are things that we can do. Jesus invited people to come and walk in the way, and we can do that. But we don't have to have it all figured out in order for that to happen. It's more simple than that, and yet it's more complex. I mean, what did Martin Luther King Jr. get assassinated for? What did he really get assassinated for? He got assassinated because he went to Selma, Alabama, and he was willing to lift up the voices of the garbage workers for better living conditions.
Right.
And why did he do that? Because he believed that if people knew about the circumstances, that it could be changed. And then I think about the people that Barbara has introduced me to in my life, and the Immokalee workers. What is the big threat with the Immokalee workers? The threat is that they come together, and their requests aren't monumental. They're small in some ways. And they have to do with today's conditions of living for these sharecroppers and these people who work in horrible conditions, like worse than slavery. To say, isn't there a way that the world community, if they knew about this, could cooperate and that it could come to an end? And guess what? It does.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, and not everything is earth-shattering or, a big conflagration like it could be just like you're going on a picnic and you're praying that it won't rain, and it rains. And so now you're disappointed. God, I prayed that it wouldn't rain on my picnic. But, in the next town, there's the farmer who's praying for it to rain.
Right.
So how do you, who is God listening? I don't think that works out. You have to have patience when things are disappointing, and you accept the goodness when it comes.
Yeah. Nothing wrong with joy. There's nothing
Right.
wrong with joy, But
Acceptance.
Yeah, but-
Acceptance, whatever comes, that's the big, understanding.
And that's why I think we have to be careful that we don't apply the idea that the blessing of God is that which comes when it's good.
Right.
That's dangerous thinking. And that brings us right back to Ezra. Because as soon as Ezra believes that these blessings, quote unquote, are from God, he begins to get arrogant and then looks to see who should not share in them. And it's a pattern for life. That's why we study it together. And you can hold me to it, and I'll hold you to it. And we try to walk in a greater sense of awareness of the God of the Bible. God of the Bible is pretty straightforward in some ways.
Yeah.
It's the human beings and the patterns of our lives that are so repetitious. It's breathtaking. You know, God, here this fledgling community that was supposed to be a blessing is rising up out of the dirt and finding life again, and they're not even 2 baby steps in the direction of having a city and a church, and they're already defining who will never be a part of us. You will never be part of us.
I was struck also in that passage when they said they didn't have any wealth. They came with no wealth.
Yes,
You know what? Maybe God
That's
doesn't
me.
really need.
No wealth.
Yeah. Maybe God doesn't need, millions of pounds of gold and silver. Maybe some of that could be sold to the benefit of the community at large. Like the Immokalee folks who say a few cents extra for a ton of tomatoes isn't going to hurt the big farmer, but it's really going to help us. It's a degree of how you look at things. I mean, what do you mean you have no wealth? You just got handed everything.
Just
share it.
Imagine if their vision for the temple had been that they were going back and they were going to build a temple and it was going to be a food pantry for all for all the people, and they had these storehouses of gold and silver, enough to feed and attend to the welfare of, because it wasn't only the Israelites who suffered under the Assyrian invasions and the Babylonian invasions. These lands, they were desolated. They were burned to the ground. Can you imagine if they carried all this back and they sent the word out that they were going to be a job training center and a food pantry, and I mean, just imagine.
They certainly had enough animals.
Well, yeah, they did. All right, my friends, we've talked a lot about the blessing of God. I still count you all as a blessing to me in my life. So.
And you also. Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you for
We'll
tuning
see you
in
next
tonight.
week.
I'll talk to you
everybody.
later. All right, bye now.
Good night.
Bye. Good night.